Today we continue our series of interviews for the Nova exhibition, which is an exhibition of objects collected by Te Manawa in the last 5 years. Today I'll be talking to Dr. Bob O'Driscoll, who has donated an iPhone. Now, this is not just any old iPhone, it is a 2008 iPhone bought on the very first day they were available. So, one of the only iPhones that might qualify to make it into a museum. Okay, let's see what he has to say.
So what was the build-up to the release of the phone like? Was there a lot of hype? Did you spend a lot of time sort of gathering information about it?
Yeah, I guess I had a number of smartphones that I'd bought in the years before Apple released the iPhone, and they were things of great promise and very limited capability, and so it was at a time when the phone manufacturers seemed to be engaged in a race to incorporate features in their phones, and so the boxes that the phones came in used to have little icons around with all the, it could do this, and this, and it seemed to be a race to have the most features. And the exercise seemed to be scoring features which you could tick off as having, but in practice they didn't necessarily work, so these things could be quite frustrating. I can remember in a meeting at Massey having my phone go off with a reminder, and I'd actually turned it on to mute, and it still went off, and it turned out there were 3 places in the phone you could turn it off, and unless you got all 3 it wouldn't turn off. And it was that sort of really anti-social or unfriendly sort of behaviour that these things exhibited that was just so completely irritating. And I was quite excited when Apple brought out the iPhone, because I'd bought an iPod a few years before. When the iPod came out, it was a thing that I couldn't see, to me, would be a particularly useful device, because I don't listen to music as I walk around and so on. And I bought one day because I wanted the little disk drive out of it to show students at Massey. And so I bought it for the disk drive. It was cheaper to buy the iPod than to buy the disk drive separately. And I played with this thing and found it was actually wonderful to use, and it had a very useful thing for me in that I could use it in my motor car, and it addressed the issue that you have in a car that the music runs out very quickly. If you put a tape in, it would only play for a short time, or a disc, and there were changer mechanisms, but you couldn't. But with an iPod, you could stick it in and listen to music for a whole trip. And so I had this device that turned out to be extremely useful in a way that I hadn't thought of. And I bought an iPod Touch when they came out, and again had been just absolutely amazed at just how nice the thing was to use. So when the phone was coming, I was quite excited, because I thought it would be something that would probably work. And so I resolved to go and get one, and so I lined up.
How big was the line? Was it one of those?
Yeah, it was one of the really long ones. So I went down to Vodafone in the square, and people had been queued up for ages for it. People had come up from Wellington to get in the queue, and I arrived a couple of hours early and thought maybe I wasn't in time. As it turned out, I got the very last one of the one. And they had the place all shut off, and were just taking people in, I think a couple at a time, because that was all they could handle, and so people were all queued up. But so I got one then, and it was, of course, one of the first in the world, because New Zealand, with our time zone, they released the phone at midnight on the particular day, and New Zealand got to midnight first, so people came actually from all over the world to be in New Zealand to get hold of them first. But in Palmerston North, they didn't open the store at midnight. They opened it at 9 o'clock as usual. But
so how come people came up from Wellington? Were they not selling it down there?
Yeah, they couldn't get one, so they'd queued up in the night time in Wellington and missed out, and so they'd come up to Palmerston North to see if they could score one here.
Sort of a plan B.
I think it was plan B, and I think some of the ones who were in the queue were employees of the places that were selling them and weren't allowed to buy them from their store, so they had to go somewhere else, I think. So there were all sorts. I was definitely the oldest person in the queue. They were mostly young, fairly keen people. But so the one I got was the first model that was sold really internationally, and New Zealand got it sort of on day one, right first. So
what was the jump like in technology in terms of what it represented and what you had before?
It was actually just an amazing experience because the thing actually did everything, and it worked. It worked absolutely perfectly. So everything worked seamlessly. The way it operated, the way phones had been pretty much up until that time, was they all had numeric keypads or had keypads of a sort, and so it was a sort of given that phones had to have buttons, and Apple eliminated the buttons and on the iPhone, and they also had a new type of touchscreen which was very responsive. The previous ones had relied on pressure to work, and this one was the first time I think a phone had a capacitive one. So it enabled a subtlety of interaction that wasn't possible with the previous things. So the thing worked by touch. It worked beautifully. It was absolutely intuitive, and it was just a delight to use. It was one of those things that you get and you think it'll be good, and when I got it, I found it was actually way better than I'd imagined. It was just one of the things that you get, which turns out to be a real delight, and you go, wow, this thing is quite amazing, and of course it set the pattern for phones from then on, because it had an enormous impact. And at that stage, for smartphones, BlackBerry was the sort of the standard for smartphones, and in terms of just phones in general, Nokia was the company that made by far the most phones, and both Nokia and BlackBerry sort of regarded the iPhone, I think, when it came out, as something of a gimmick to their cost. In fact, the companies that are really successful now in phones like Samsung, and that Samsung saw what Apple did and did it very, very closely, and were successful because of it. In fact, because they sort of captured the sort of essence and cottoned on very quickly to what was needed. It turned out, I mean, they had perhaps a wee bit of a head start in the sense that they were actually manufacturing the phone for Apple, so they had an inside look at what was going on. But yeah, so there'd been a sort of progression of handheld devices. The first one that was really significant for me, and I've actually given to Manawa, was the Hewlett-Packard brought out the first scientific calculator. I've given to Manawa a number of devices that I sort of considered were disruptive, in the sense that when they came out, everything changed afterwards. And after Hewlett-Packard brought out the scientific calculator, what scientists had done before them was that they'd use slide rules, and that was how they did calculations sort of in the lab. You had a slide rule, and you might have a big sort of machine type calculator to do heavy duty calculations, but for portable carrying around with you, it was always a slide rule. And Hewlett-Packard brought out this pocket device that would do everything a slide rule would do, and do it much better, and that just totally changed things. And it actually, their scientific calculator sort of set the pattern, and scientific calculators, pocket ones, just look like that HP35 now, and it looks a very modern device, even though it was pre-LCD displays. It used LEDs because they didn't have but it still looks very modern, even though it was 1974. And so that was the sort of first handheld device that was sort of had a big impact. Portable navigation things, again, were another thing that really fascinated me, was because having sort of done tramping and things and navigated with compasses and maps, to actually have a machine that would tell me exactly where I was just wonderful. And I bought a very early handheld Garmin navigator, and of course cameras, which I've always been interested in. Photography started getting smaller, and that. And one of the things I used to think about as I was riding my bike out to Massey was these pocket devices. It surely is possible eventually to actually make a device that combines all of these. And of course the phone, when it came out, the first iPhone had GPS built into it. It had a camera built into it. And of course nowadays phones, they have absolutely credible cameras for a portable camera. You know, a phone will really give dedicated cameras a run for their money. The navigation things in phones are sort of second to none nowadays. And so you actually have this device that combines all these handheld things that came and were sort of individually exciting. They've sort of merged into a phone. And so you have this this thing which really was, it's sort of changed the way people operated, hasn't it? Because they're personal organisers. There was a period when there were Palm Pilots and things like that people had to sort of organise their lives. Again, that's done. To do your internet and everything nowadays, it's your phone. And
in just 8 years.
It's just all changed, hasn't it? And so that device coming out, the sort of internet-connected device, and that was one of the things that the first iPhone was. It was an internet-connected device, and I'd had phones that purported to be internet-connected, but they didn't work. They would only work with a special watered-down version of the internet and so on, whereas these things just went and grabbed the internet as it was, and it wasn't a compromise, it just did it. Whereas before, if you wanted to do it, you could sort of do it, but you had to find websites that could do the sort of thing that the phone could do, and it didn't really work. And I had one phone that it didn't work at all. I mean, it advertised that it could do internet, but I could never get it to work, and I eventually got the phone company that sold it to me to admit that, it doesn't actually work. Hey, but it says on the box, but no, it didn't. And so that was the dramatic difference with the iPhone. It said it would do these things, and hey, it did it. And there wasn't any nonsense about it. It just did it properly. And it also, what Apple did was that they actually wrested control of the design of the phones away from the phone companies, because what companies like the cellular providers, they used to sort of determine what facilities the phone would have, and then stuck a whole lot of people called it bloatware, but it was their software that would work well or not so well on the phones, generally interfered with their operation. And what Apple did say, this gets our software and you can't stick anything that we don't approve of on this device. We will not let you. And so they actually had complete control of the device and made sure that its integrity wasn't destroyed. I suppose they also, the fact with the iPhone is it's an integration of hardware, which before I think there's sort of been an emphasis on the hardware and trying to make the hardware work with enough software to make it work. But Apple, of course, is really strong in the software, and the iPhone worked because it's a combination of software, hardware, and the whole deal, all as a package, all totally integrated. And Apple managed to do it because they had control and they insisted, and there were a lot of companies wouldn't sell it. Vodafone wouldn't sell it because initially, after the first year, they did, because they saw how much the companies that were selling it were making money with this phone. But it's a change that managed to get that's happened, that the manufacturer of the phones now sort of, I think, control how their phones behave, whereas it used to be the cellular providers had that control. And I think Apple's drive is the experience of the user, whereas I think the cellular providers, the phones were set to sell their product, make people connect to their network and keep giving them money, but the experience for the phone wasn't first in their minds, whereas Apple, I think, really did genuinely. I sort of, when I heard reports of Steve Jobs' reaction to the phones that were around before the iPhone, I thought, yeah, that's how I feel too. And I could sort of sense a kindred spirit, that here was someone who was in a position to do something about it, who was going to sort this thing out and produce the sort of phone that people might want to use, rather than what you were given. So that was,
You mentioned this phone still works.
Oh yeah,
8 years later.
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it still goes. I've tended to, because I'm sort of a bit of a technology geek, sort of keep buying the latest ones, so that my phones are all, and that's the only one that's not still in use in the family. So all the ones I've bought since are still being used by members of the family, and that one I kept because it was the oldest one, with the thought that it was probably was a significant device, and that it probably was an appropriate thing for Te Manawa to have. So I'd sort of kept that aside. But it's still running. It still works just fine.
Right. It sounds like you mentioned the calculator. You've developed a sort of an instinct for knowing which technology is worth sort of keeping on.
Yeah, I've always been sort of interested in the interaction of people with devices. As you know, I mean, my interest at Massey was in electronics, and I've been fascinated with electronic devices that are inaccessible to people. A classic one, I guess, is the videotape recorder that used to come with a zillion buttons, and everyone had one, but very few people could program them to record programs because they were so complicated to operate and so on. So the way in which these electronic or devices, way people interact with them, has always been a fascination for me. I remember hiring a car once and wanting to turn up the volume on the radio, and I actually had to stop the car and sit down because it was just an array of buttons. I'm trying to think, well, where's the one that changes the volume? And it's just, this thing is just so terribly unfriendly. You know, how can you do that to someone and give them something that's just so totally unusable? And so
it wasn't a knob.
It wasn't a knob. You know, a big knob would have done it. Yeah, and it's those sorts of things. The way you interact with things has sort of fascinated me. So I've been interested in devices that actually perform well and are actually useful to the user, and what is it about those things it's always been a fascination for me. So HP with their calculator, when they brought it out, they did a huge amount of effort into the design of it in terms of how would you make something like this that would actually be useful to the user and so on. And it was interesting to me that it was an industrial designer who determined the configuration of it, not the engineers who were designing the device. They had to produce a device that conformed to what it had to deliver in the end. So an awful lot of things get produced because people make them because they can, and then they sell them, and they sell what they made, rather than, and it really impressed me at the time that Hewlett-Packard. They devoted one issue of the Hewlett-Packard Journal to the development of that particular thing and showed how they had done it. And there was a huge amount of effort on how the final user would interact with it and how it would deliver the goods for them, for the user. And so it was very user-focused, the design. And they did it extremely well. As I say, if I showed it to you, it almost looks like a modern calculator, because basically they got it right first time. Yeah.
Has it been fascinating sort of watching the iterative improvements from 2008 to the present day?
Oh yeah. It's really interesting because several times I've bought a phone and thought, right, this has got all the things that I need. I'm not going to have to, and then they managed to do something that I hadn't thought of, and think, wow, I can't do with that. And things like fingerprint recognition for unlocking the phone, and of course that's just wonderful. You can just put your finger on it, and I hadn't sort of thought that would happen, because I had experienced fingerprint readers, which, like a lot of other things, sort of worked but mostly didn't, and I was horrified when I heard rumours that Apple was going to do it. Oh no, this is not going to work. But actually they produced something that does work, and it works extraordinarily well, and that's amazing that you can do it. It's just great. I'm looking forward to later this year when they update their software for their computers, because I won't have to type in my password to unlock my computer. My watch, the fact that I'm wearing it will unlock the computer, so that's just sort of quite useful.
How much further do you think they can go along the design track they've set themselves on?
I'm always surprised. You think of things, and these guys are always better than me, and I keep getting surprised at the sorts of things they do. So I've got Apple's Watch, which effectively works in conjunction with the phone, and I've sort of been a bit of a watch geek in the sense that I've always wanted a watch that was extremely accurate, and now for the first time I've got a watch that's accurate to a 20th of a second always, and when you change time zones it just changes automatically, and when the daylight saving happens it changes. So as a watch it's absolutely fabulous, but it has all these other things that when somebody sends me a message it taps me on the wrist and I can read the message on my watch, or if my phone rings I can answer it on my watch, and just all sorts of things like that which I think, well, that's quite cute that it can do that too. But
Seems that's also at once both quite futuristic and at the same time kind of retro, sort of Dick Tracy style.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just looks like a watch, eh? But it does all those things, and it's actually working in conjunction with the phone, and that the phone's doing all the work, and the watch is just almost like an ancillary to it. But when you're walking along, you don't have to get your phone out of your pocket and fumble. You can just slide your watch up, which is it's one of these things that again it was probably the thing that I spent the longest trying to decide whether I was going to buy, and it's turned out to be one of the things that's delighted me enormously, is just how well it works. So it's quite surprising. I like things to keep looking new, and it has sort of wonderful coating, but it has about the hardness of carbon.
Okay.
This is that black coating, so that this is nearly a year old, and there's not
not a scratch on it.
There's not a scratch on it. The fact that they were able to do that, it's just silly little things about it.
I think they're really interesting in terms. I mean, I'm not a big phone man or watch man myself, but it's still.
No, it's just. I mean, as a kid, I was always interested in how things worked, so I always took everything that I could get apart and look inside, and at Massey, whenever anything new came, people like Udo would hand me the screwdriver when I came in, because the first thing I wanted to do was see inside, and so I'm always just curious as to how things work, and I'm just fascinated by the way things are done. So I'm interested in these sorts of things just as devices and so on, and they are actually very beautifully made, sort of inside and out. Old computers, you lifted the covers and it was just horrendous to look inside, but some of the things, that's one of the things that distinguishes the Apple computers, is that when you look inside, they're actually very beautiful and very tidy. That they worry about the bits you can't see. I think Steve Jobs told a story about his father insisting that he paint the back of the fence that no one could see just as well as the front, because it was there, and even though you couldn't see it, it had to be right, and it's that sort of philosophy I think he sort of instilled, so that just the attention to detail, no matter where you know, if you open it up, you get the feeling that the people creating these things actually care about them. And,
not a wasted cubic micrometer.
Yeah. So that sort of fascinates me, because that's the sort of thing that worries me too. I like everything to sort of look beautiful and be very nicely done. So
It's that first iPhone surely rang those bells.
Yes, it did. So it ticked all sorts of boxes and things for me, which was why I got quite excited about it at the time. Yeah.